President Donald Trump has pleaded not guilty to 4 felony charges over his efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Trump entered the plea Thursday in the same federal district court in Washington, D.C., where more than 1,000 of his supporters have faced criminal charges over the January 6, 2021 attack on the Capitol. Prosecutors, led by special counsel Jack Smith, requested a speedy trial, while Trump's legal team asked the magistrate judge for more time to review documents and evidence in the case. It's part of Trump's legal strategy to delay the criminal cases against him until after the 2024 election, which he hopes he'll win and then could pardon himself.
All those who support Donald Trump and his election delay tactics are those who don't want to hear the truth. There's no reason to support delaying of the trial. You will want the trial open, aired. You will fight and petition for them to bring cameras in the federal courtroom because you want to hear the evidence of this trial read out before you decide who is going to be your president. And anyone who is in support of Donald Trump delaying the trial until after the election is someone who is okay with ending democracy. They are okay with voting someone in office who have attempted to take away our democracy. And they do not want it exposed before the election.
First pretrial hearing is set for August 28th. Trump spoke after the arraignment.
When you look at what's happening, this is a persecution of a political opponent. This was never supposed to happen in America. This is the persecution of the person that's leading by very, very substantial numbers in the Republican primary and leading Biden by a lot. So if you can't beat him, you persecute him or you prosecute him. We can't let this happen in America.
Going forward, the legal proceedings in this case will be presided over by U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan, an Obama appointee who has issued some of the toughest sentences for the January 6 rioters, often going beyond what the prosecutors asked for. Judge Chutkan is black, as are many of those now prosecuting Trump. Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, New York Attorney General Letitia James, Fulton County DA Fani Willis. They've all received racist threats. Meanwhile, the Fulton County Sheriff, Patrick Labatt, who's also black, said Tuesday the former president would not receive any special treatment if Trump's indicted in Georgia, where he's being investigated for election interference. Labatt said, quote, "It doesn't matter your status. We have mugshots ready for you."
I want us to understand how it's been an issue that black prosecutors are prosecuting Trump, but over the centuries, us dealing in America and their judicial system since they created the 13th Amendment, it has not been an issue with white supremacists or white people in general prosecuting black people. And we see that there has been lots of errors and misjudgments and overjudgments of black people, them viewing us as criminals, them sentencing us to more time than they sentence whites for the same offense. So we see all those things occur, but black people and everybody else is silent when it's blacks who are being sentenced by white people, when it's blacks who are being governed by white people. But now all of a sudden, if blacks are in a position to hold white people accountable, oh, here's the race issue again. But there's no race issue when it's white people prosecuting and sentencing black men and overfilling their prison system. But the reason why there's no racism and that is not an issue is because you black people have not stood up to that. You have allowed and accepted yourself to be perceived and targeted upon as criminals. You have allowed Europeans to impoverish you and then criminalize your people for their reaction to their impoverishment. However, white people are not allowing the same. They are not allowing white people to be held accountable for outright crimes, because they will not allow themselves to be governed by a people that they see as separate to them.
Tonight and going forward on this show, we want to introduce you to some of the states of our disunion, states where Americans are struggling to exercise their right to vote, to make their way out of poverty, and to live free of government control of their wombs. We will cover the states facing the hardest struggles for democracy, the ones banning books and curtailing the right to choose and passing draconian anti-trans laws. But we'll also show you some of the states that are winning, where our democracy is working. But tonight we want to start with a state that unfortunately is still stuck in its white supremacist past, Mississippi, where a white supermajority in the heavily gerrymandered state house voted to create an entirely separate court system and expanded police force within the city of Jackson, the blackest city in America, that would be appointed completely by white state officials. That means that the voters of Jackson, which is 80% black, do not get to elect the judges or prosecutors in this separate district, unlike what happens in every other part of the state. White officials currently hold all the statewide positions that would do the appointing, and no black official has ever held any of these positions. In fact, the last time a black Mississippian held statewide office was during Reconstruction. And the state, despite being 1/3 African American, is gerrymandered to have exactly one black congressman, Representative and January 6th Committee Chairman Benny Thompson. Meanwhile, the Republican who introduced this draconian bill says it's because of the high crime rates and backlog of court cases in the county that contains Jackson, which, did I mention, is the state capital. Jackson's mayor has called the plan colonialist and racist and said it reminds him of apartheid. And joining me now is the mayor of Jackson, Chokwe Antar Lumumba. And Mayor Lumumba, please explain how it can be possible that the capital of Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, is, I think, to your point, going to be governed under apartheid style.
Well, I think that to speak to it honestly, I'm reflecting on the words of Coach Dennis Green, who once said that they are who we thought they were. As we've been calling out these clearly racist policies, that has been done much to the chagrin of state leadership, saying that we're giving Mississippi a black eye. And to be clear, it is not our words that give Mississippi a black eye. It is the actions that they're taking, actions that will not allow or disenfranchise voters in Jackson, Mississippi. This particular law is fraught with constitutional violations, equal protection. It is seeking to create a district which is the most densely white populated area in the city of Jackson. In addition to a police force or a militarized force that does not have direct accountability to the residents. Within the district that already exists, there have been numerous claims of issues of police misconduct that are not being challenged, that are not being followed up on. And so there's a multitude of concerns here.
It sounds like...
So be clear, that was the basis of January 6th. The basis of them saying take back our country is that they want a white dominant society, one that is in favor of white supremacy, and that is the representation of Trump to them.
Donald Trump's defenders are continually saying, I'm thinking of people like Kevin McCarthy, right, the House Speaker, saying he's just being accused of thought crimes, things he thought or said, and anyone can say or think things. But this is the Atlantic journalist Adam Serwer, who is pointing out on social media The indictment makes clear that Donald Trump and his accomplices planned to seize power by force and then maintain that power through mass murder of American citizens by their own military. The indictment says this. Also on January 4th, when co-conspirator 2 acknowledged to the defendant's senior advisor that no court would support his proposal, the senior advisor told co-conspirator 2, "You're going to cause riots in the streets." Co-conspirator 2 responded there had previously been points in the nation's history where violence was necessary to protect the republic.
Was one thing you weren't allowed to research.
We were refused. We were rejected by the librarian.
When I asked about or inquired about 1898, they wanted to know why.
I was told that, yes, they had something, but they kept it under lock and key.
The story of Wilmington in 18 is the story of an American election, but also of something we don't usually find in American history: the violent overthrow of a democratically elected government. In the late 1800s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the state's largest city. It had a majority Black population, and historians today describe it as a rarity in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of Black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful Black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also Black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are Black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 Black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899. The Democratic and Republican parties of 1898 in many ways occupied opposite parts of the political spectrum than they do today.
Most African Americans were voting for the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party was white voters almost exclusively. White supremacy was the central focus of the platform for the Democratic Party.
Republican
January 6th was an easily foreseeable act. All we had to do was understand history, but because we do not have an understanding of history, because we have relegated the education of us and our next generation off to others to be educated, we are not aware about what we as Black people have faced and continue to face here in America. Because if we had been abreast of our own history, then we would have understood January 6th would come due to the election of Obama. Any perceived progress by Black people have been met with white rage. That white rage has been enacted in violence. We only speak of Tulsa, Oklahoma, as far as Black Wall Street, but there has been many of Black communities that have been sabotaged, destroyed, due to white rage occurring from Black success. Them successfully hiding the progress that Black people made working within our own social groups after slavery during the Reconstruction period has prevented us from making any progress since the Jim Crow era. Because the Jim Crow era was created to destroy the success that we had created during Reconstruction. So America First coup occurred in the South to prevent or to stop America's Reconstruction where Blacks were progressing.
in North Carolina were successful in part because of a third party called the Populist Party, made up of mostly white farmers fed up with the tough economic times. North Carolina populists joined up with Republicans to form what they called the Fusion Party. And in the elections of 1894 and 1896, the Fusion Party defeated the Democrats in sweeping victories statewide. That meant North Carolina now had a government that shared power between black and white politicians, including a newly elected Republican governor. Together, they moved towards reforms that would favor black Americans and working-class whites.
This was something that the Democratic Party folks were simply not going to accept.
A multiracial government wasn't just a disappointment for Democrats. It was more like a humiliation. They needed a plan to take back control of the state in the next election. So party leaders like Furnifold Simmons, future U.S. Senator, Charles Aycock, future North Carolina governor, and this man, Alfred Moore Waddell, came up with one: to beat the Fusion Party by luring white populist voters away from their alliance with black voters. Wilmington, with a large black population and a local fusion government in power, would be a focus of their campaign. The state Democratic Party handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it."
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Now, you've tried to clarify this statement in recent days, Donald, but I guess
So when you talk about then and now, Trump came in on the same campaign practices. Birtherism was an attack on Obama being black and being the president, not being the rightful America. Then he came in using the Mexicans as rapists, stoking white fear, xenophobia, which is fear of others, stroking that, using crime, stroking that as a means to pull white people together in order to gain this powerful Trump support. History repeats itself.
Their most effective tool was the media. One of North Carolina's biggest newspapers was a Democratic Party mouthpiece. It ran racist political cartoons throughout 1898.
Not everybody was literate in 1898, but to see a political cartoon of the type that ran, you may not be able to read it, but you know exactly what it means.
Many of the cartoons were centered on the threat of Negro rule, even though the fusion government was mostly white. They also played up another fear.
Black men threatening white women became a theme. White men need to do all that they can to protect white womanhood.
This was all part of North Carolina Democratic strategy, but it echoed the national racist rhetoric of the time. In one speech that Democrats printed in a Wilmington paper, a prominent Georgia writer named Rebecca Felton said,
"If it takes lynching a black man a day to protect white womanhood, I say lynch."
Her speech prompted.
Well, I want black women to take note of this white woman who just made this speech about if it takes lynching a black man a day is one of the founders of the women's suffrage movement. This is one of the white women you aligned yourselves with to hand over black people's civil rights movement too. This is why white women now receive 85% of all civil rights movement, because black women joined white women in the suffrage movement when it wasn't black men who preventing white women from voting, but white men. It's not black men who is responsible for pay inequality in America. Black man who is responsible for pay inequality in America. It is white men who is responsible for pay inequality in America. However, our black women have handed over our civil rights movement to white women and homosexuals, rather than returning back to the black family or nucleus. And this is why we have not built a strong, powerful black nation. One of the reasons.
Wilmington black man named Alex Manley, owner of the black-run Daily Record newspaper, to respond with a column. He made a simple observation that, at the time, was shocking.
That white women who had liaisons with black men did so voluntarily and enthusiastically.
Manley wrote, "Every Negro lynched is called a big burly black brute, when in fact many were sufficiently attractive for white girls to fall in love with them."
Manley pretty much said, in a nutshell, sometimes white women choose to be with black men.
Manley's editorial became another tool for Democrats. Newspapers reprinted it, called it a horrid slander, and ran comments about it on a daily basis. It was just a few months before the election, and white voters were angry.
By the time the election rolls around on November 8th, black voters, Republican voters, had been thoroughly intimidated here.
By all accounts, the elections of 1898 were a sham. The Democratic Party had a paramilitary group called the Red Shirts. They attacked and blocked black residents from voting. At a rally just before the election, Alfred Moore Waddell provoked the crowds. He said, "Negro office holding ought at once and forever be brought to an end, even if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses." The votes were counted, and the Democrats won.
Democratic candidates won every seat. They had a candidate up for election.
Doesn't that sound familiar? When Trump did his gathering at the eclipse, and he told them if they don't have a country, they have to fight like hell. Or when Rudy Giuliani said trial by combat. Doesn't that sound familiar? Then they marched to the Capitol and rioted and took over the Capitol building. History repeats itself.
But some local fusionist politicians remained in power because their seats hadn't been up for re-election, like the white Republican mayor and the Board of Aldermen. And of course, the election did nothing to undo the economic power black folks held in the city. The Democrats had won the election, but their goal of total white supremacist control remained out of reach.
And so they engineered what was essentially a coup d'etat.
The day after the election, at a gathering for white men in Wilmington, the Democrats unveiled a document called the White Declaration of Independence. It contained an ultimatum. Cynthia Brown, whose descendants were in Wilmington back in 1898, is a historian at her church where there's a preserved copy of the declaration from the next day's newspaper.
"We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin."
They would strip black men of voting rights. They would give white men a large part of the employment heretofore given to black men. And as for Alex Manley, "We demand that he leave this city forever within 24 hours. The next morning,
it's sad how few of my black people understand how we got in this condition and that we was not always in this condition, and lack of understanding of how much we rose up out of slavery is preventing us from being able to excel today. But they intentionally hide how well black people did during the Reconstruction period in order to keep the ideal out your mind to become self-sufficient and to build your own communities again. In addition to the fear that black people have that white people will come again and destroy your community. But putting your head in the sand like an ostrich and not being aware of your surroundings is not going to save you. You have to be aware of history and understand history repeats itself and that they are going to do this thing again. And we have to start to become better prepared. Any progress black people make will anger white people. And white people respond and act out their anger through violence. I know you have the perception that it is black people who are violent and are willing to do these type of things. But if you look into history, it has always been white people. And all I'm saying is if you knew history, if you knew about Wilmington, Carolina, then you would have predicted January 6th coming when Obama became president.
Hundreds of white men marched to the offices of the Daily Record. Manley was gone. He had fled to save his own life. They set the Daily Record building on fire. This is where it once stood.
Once the white leadership destroyed Alex Manley's printing press, they destroyed one way in which the African American community in Wilmington could organize itself and keep itself informed.
At City Hall, the mayor and board of aldermen were forced out.
There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Waddell, who once threatened to fill the Cape Fear River with black bodies, was the new mayor of Wilmington. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled into the streets. In these photos, X's mark where the first black residents were killed.
The stories are that they were dumped into the river, and there are varying stories about how many people were killed.
I see 40 to 60 clearly as fatalities as a result of the violence, but I think it was higher.
Many black residents hid for days in the swamps and the wooded cemeteries in the city, including Cynthia's great-grandmother. And thousands of other residents fled Wilmington, never to return. Shortly afterward, Democrats printed booklets celebrating a glorious victory, and in the newspapers depicted black residents as the instigators.
This image is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened during 1898. You know, what you see is African American men with guns, not white men with machine guns.
The city never regained its black majority population. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests and poll taxes that prevented black people from voting were immediately enacted, and Wilmington's spirit of black opportunity was crushed. Black political representation in the state was over. It would be 90 years until North Carolina elected its next black Congress member.
Wilmington did a really great job of covering up a very dark past for a very long time.
January 6th is a rerun. The problem is we haven't seen the episode because we are unfamiliar with our own history here in America. If we were familiar with Wilmington, Carolina, then we would have been prepared for what was about to occur with the election of Obama. We would have been aware that militia groups would be growing in mass numbers with the perceived progress of black people. Wilmington, Carolina, Black Wall Street, and various other black towns such as Rosewoods are examples of what happens when blacks begin to progress and white rage occurs behind that. So the January 6th is not the first coup in America's history. Anytime black people have gained prominence, you have been met with white rage. The same way Trump came into power on birtherism.